The darkness of the night had settled over the town. Only the howling wind and the rustling of dry leaves being dragged between the trees could be heard. As Thomas drove down the narrow forest road illuminated by the car's headlights, a growing sense of unease consumed him. They had just moved to the small town, and tonight was the first night that would shape the rest of their lives. "Dad, when will we get there?" Oliver asked from the front seat, looking out the window. His voice was tired but filled with curiosity. Escaping the noise of city life had become a necessity for both of them. However, a new town, especially one as desolate and dark as this, seemed more frightening than Thomas had anticipated. "Just a bit longer, son," Thomas replied, but the words were meant to reassure not only Oliver but himself as well. The road was becoming narrower and more ominous in the darkness. Shadows of large tree branches occasionally appeared on the road, illuminated by the headlights, moving as if they were alive. Finally, the first lights of the town began to appear. This small old town, seemingly a forgotten corner of time, with its stone houses and narrow streets, made Thomas feel as if he had stepped into another world. Oliver excitedly looked out the window as they entered the town center. Everything seemed new and mysterious to him. "This might be just the place we were looking for," Thomas said as he stopped the car. But the unease inside him hadn't faded. He could sense that something was wrong in this town. When they stopped in front of a stone building, an elderly woman came out to greet them. The woman, with deep wrinkles on her face, seemed to carry the town's past with her. "Welcome," she said with a slight smile. "I'm Martha. I've been expecting you." Martha's presence somewhat eased Thomas's apprehension. He followed the woman, bringing his son along. As they entered the house, they were greeted by a warm environment and the crackling of a wood fire. However, even inside the house, it was impossible to shake off the influence of the darkness outside. Old photographs hanging on the walls seemed to whisper the town's history in the dark. Martha showed them to a place to sit and added a few more logs to the wood stove. "This town is not as peaceful as it seems from the outside," she said, her eyes locked onto Thomas's. "There are things here that are best left alone." Though Thomas appeared to disregard the woman's words, he was inwardly trying to decipher their meaning. "What kind of things?" he asked. Martha sighed deeply and closed her eyes. "In the forest, there's an old bridge called Midnight Bridge. Don't go near it. Especially Oliver. The curse of that bridge dates back a long time. Many children have crossed that bridge, but none have ever returned." Oliver, upon hearing Martha's words, instinctively felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder to comfort him. "Don't worry," Thomas said, casting a glance at Martha. "It's just a town legend, isn't it?" Martha silently nodded, but the expression in her eyes continued to unsettle Thomas. He wasn't sure if there was any truth to the woman's words, but he promised himself that he wouldn't attempt to find the bridge. That night, as they lay in their beds, Thomas's thoughts wandered. Martha's warnings echoed in his mind. He was unable to sleep, but Oliver fell into a deep sleep quickly. However, around midnight, Oliver's dreams began to disturb him. He was crossing a bridge in his dream, but he couldn't understand what happened when he reached the other side, only hearing a voice calling him. When he opened his eyes, he was alone in his room. The darkness seemed to gather in the corners of the room, and the voice he heard in his dream still echoed in the depths of his mind. He got out of bed and went to the window. The town was silent, but somewhere within him, he felt a strong urge to see that bridge. As the first light of dawn illuminated the town, Thomas and Oliver woke up in their new home. Both were a bit unsettled by the journey from the previous night and Martha's warnings, but they had to move forward with their lives in this town. After quickly preparing breakfast for Oliver, Thomas decided to head to the town center. He wanted to familiarize himself with the surroundings and meet the locals. The town was notable for its silence. The old stone buildings, narrow streets, and cobblestone paths all suggested that this place defied the passage of time. Though the townspeople seemed friendly at first glance, Thomas felt that something was missing in their gazes. It was as if these people were not just living, but were also hiding something. Thomas took Oliver by the hand and walked towards the town's main square. In the center of the square was a large fountain, the sound of its water bringing a sense of tranquility, but Thomas's inner unease remained. As he held his son's hand tightly, he noticed Oliver examining his surroundings with curiosity. "Dad, aren't there any other kids here?" Oliver asked, noticing the silence in the square. Thomas looked around, and indeed, there were no children in sight. At that moment, he noticed some activity at a shop on the corner a little further ahead. Letting go of Oliver's hand, they headed towards the shop. It was a small market. Shelves were stocked with fresh fruits, vegetables, and daily necessities for the townspeople. An elderly man sat behind the counter, watching Thomas and Oliver intently. "Good morning," Thomas said as he entered. "We just moved here and need to do some shopping." The man nodded and tried to smile, but his smile did not seem sincere to Thomas. "Welcome," he said, his voice weary and heavy. "This town has seen many newcomers, but most don't stay long." Thomas sensed something odd in the man's words, but dismissed it. "We plan to stay for a while," he replied. "My son Oliver will be starting school here too." The man looked at Oliver and frowned. "Children should be careful here," he said. "There are places they need to stay away from." Thomas understood what the man was hinting at, but did not wish to discuss it further. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll be careful." Oliver found an old map on one of the store's shelves and picked it up. The map showed the forest and roads surrounding the town. A spot was marked in red ink in the corner of the map. "Dad, what's this?" Oliver asked, pointing to the map. Thomas glanced at the map and noticed the marked spot. It was located deep in the forest. "That must be Midnight Bridge," said the shopkeeper, taking the map from Oliver. "That bridge is cursed. No one should go there." The shopkeeper's words unsettled Thomas. Every townsfolk seemed to talk about this bridge, but no one explained exactly what was cursed about it. "It's just a bridge," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Why would it be so dangerous?" The man folded the map and put it back on the shelf, shaking his head. "There are things that can't be explained," he said. "But when you feel them, you understand what we mean. Midnight Bridge has taken many children in the past, and never given them back." Oliver listened carefully to the man's words, but Thomas did not want to dwell on the topic any longer. He took his son and left the shop. However, the strange atmosphere hanging over the town deeply affected Thomas. On the way back, he noticed the door of Martha's house was ajar. A faint beam of light from inside cast a warm glow outside. Thomas decided to leave Oliver at home and visit Martha. He needed to learn more about the town's history and the secret of Midnight Bridge. When he gently knocked on the door, Martha's calm yet wise face reappeared. "Come in, I've been expecting you," Martha said, welcoming Thomas inside. As Thomas sat down, Martha offered him a warm cup of tea. The peaceful atmosphere in the room eased some of Thomas's tension. "I want to learn more about Midnight Bridge," Thomas said, getting straight to the point. "It seems like almost everyone in town is afraid of that bridge." Martha took a sip of her tea and took a deep breath. "The bridge is not just a structure," she began. "It carries the darkest secrets of the town. Centuries ago, a great tragedy occurred in this town. A group of children went to that bridge while playing in the forest. None of them returned after that day." Thomas listened carefully to Martha's words, but thought such legends were common in the histories of towns. "What if it's just a story?" he asked. Maybe the children got lost somewhere else. Martha shook her head from side to side. It's not a legend, it's real, she said with certainty. The children who disappeared at that bridge never returned. Their souls still wander in the depths of the forest. Every child who goes to that bridge shares the same fate. Thomas was surprised by Martha's certainty. There was a sadness and fear in her eyes. I won't let my son go near that bridge, he said resolutely. But why are you so sure? What's there? Martha looked away from Thomas. No one knows exactly what's there, she said quietly. But in the depths of the forest, on the other side of the bridge, there's something, a dark force. That force draws innocent souls to itself and never lets them go. After hearing Martha's words, Thomas left her house, but what she had said continued to linger in his mind. He promised himself that he would keep his son away from that bridge, but deep down, he felt a strong desire to find out if the curse was real. Thomas returned home with his mind in turmoil after hearing Martha's account. Seeing that Oliver had fallen asleep gave him a slight sense of relief. However, the thoughts racing through his mind kept him awake throughout the night. The rumors surrounding Midnight Bridge had permeated every corner of the town, suggesting that this seemingly quiet and peaceful place harbored a dark secret. Thomas, however, was a man who didn't believe in such legends. He always preferred logical and scientific explanations, but the unease within him refused to subside. In the morning, Thomas prepared Oliver for school and took him to the school gate. The town school was a small but well-maintained building. A few students and teachers waiting in front of the school greeted Thomas politely. However, there was a similar reluctance in their eyes to that of the elderly man he had encountered the previous day. As Thomas was about to leave after dropping Oliver off, a woman who he assumed was the school principal approached him. This tall, elegantly dressed woman looked at Thomas with a serious expression. "Hello, I'm Rachel Mortimer," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm the principal of the school. Your son is Oliver, I presume." Thomas shook the woman's hand. "Yes, that's correct. I'm Thomas. My son is new to this town. I hope he adjusts quickly." Rachel looked at Oliver and nodded with a slight smile. The children here usually get along well, so Oliver should have no trouble fitting in. However, Rachel paused for a moment, as if she had something to say but wasn't sure how to express it. Noticing the woman's hesitation, Thomas encouraged her. "However, what? Is there a problem?" Rachel took a deep breath and looked down. This town might seem a bit frightening to outsiders. You'll hear many legends about Midnight Bridge, but no matter what, keep Oliver away from that area. It will be best for both of you. Thomas had heard this warning before, but Rachel's tone of concern unsettled him. "Why does everyone fear this bridge so much?" he asked, unable to restrain himself. "What really is there?" Rachel turned her eyes back to Thomas. "No one really knows what's there," she said in a whisper-like voice. "But many of the dark events in the town's history are linked to that bridge. Children who went there didn't come back. Those who did were never the same." Thomas fell silent after these words. Rachel's statements seemed to corroborate Martha's account from the previous night. He thanked her and left the school, but his curiosity had only grown. He was determined to uncover the secrets of this town and Midnight Bridge. As the day progressed, Thomas returned home and decided to do some research online. He hoped to find something about the town's past. However, he found no information about Midnight Bridge in any of the sources he checked. It was as if the bridge was a secret place known only outside the town. This fueled Thomas's determination even more. He wanted to see this bridge with his own eyes. That evening, when Oliver returned from school, Thomas decided to ask him about Midnight Bridge. However, Oliver avoided discussing it. "Dad, the teachers don't want us to go there," he said in a timid voice. "Let's not go, okay?" Seeing his son so scared, Thomas didn't want to force the issue. "Of course we won't go," he replied, "but I want to understand why this bridge is so dangerous." That night, after tucking Oliver in, Thomas couldn't fall asleep. His curiosity was troubling him more and more. Eventually, unable to withstand it, he decided to leave the house. He quietly opened the back door and started walking towards the bridge in the darkness. As he entered the forest path, the air grew colder. The branches of the trees rustled faintly in the wind. Thomas turned on his cell phone's light and tried to see ahead. The path narrowed, and he felt he was getting closer to the bridge. A few minutes later, he saw an old stone bridge emerging from the mist between the trees. This must be Midnight Bridge. As Thomas approached the bridge, his tension increased. His heart was racing, and his breathing was rapid, but suppressing his fear, he stepped onto the bridge. The bridge was oddly cold, as if it had a life of its own. The sound of the river below echoed through the night's silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Thomas thought the bridge was just a bridge, and all these fears were unfounded. But just as he was about to turn back, he felt a movement behind him. He turned quickly but saw nothing. The darkness had swallowed everything. Taking a deep breath and looking ahead again, a figure appeared in the middle of the bridge. Amid the mist, a dark shadow. At first, Thomas thought it was just an optical illusion, but the shadow slowly moved and approached Thomas. Thomas's heart felt like it was going to leap out of his chest. He squinted and tried to see more clearly. The figure resembled a human silhouette, but it had no face, no eyes, ears, or nose. Nothing. Just a void. The sight left Thomas stunned. At that moment, his body was frozen, unable to move forward or backward. As the figure slowly approached him, thousands of thoughts raced through Thomas's mind. Holding his breath, he waited to see what the figure would do. But just as the figure was about to reach him, it suddenly merged into the mist and vanished. Thomas jerked as if waking from a nightmare. His body was icy, and his breathing was irregular. Muttering to himself, he said, "This must be just a dream. It can't be real." He quickly turned back from the bridge and fled through the forest towards home. When he reached home, he closed and locked the door quickly. But the fear he felt still hadn't left him. There was indeed something at that bridge, and that something was following him. Thomas took a deep breath after locking the house door. His heart was still racing, and the images in his mind were more vivid than ever. The fact that the figure he encountered on the bridge had no eyes, not even a face, had scared him to the brink of madness. Trying to calm himself, he went to the kitchen, took a trembling sip of water, but it didn't ease the knot in his throat. He tried to steady his thoughts, but each time, the image of that dark figure appeared in his mind. "It must be just a hallucination," Thomas mumbled, trying to convince himself. "I was stressed, tired, that's all." But a voice inside him said the experience was real. Midnight Bridge was indeed cursed, and that curse had found him. Battling these thoughts, he walked to Oliver's room. He quietly opened the door and, seeing his son sleeping peacefully, felt a bit relieved. Looking at Oliver's innocent face, he was reminded of the need to protect him from the town's dangers. But this didn't mean he could quell his own curiosity. Thomas struggled through the night. As he closed his eyes, he relived the moment on the bridge, feeling the figure approach. Fortunately, by morning, these thoughts had somewhat dispersed. However, the desire to uncover the bridge's secret still gnawed at him. At breakfast with Oliver, He tried to act as if nothing had happened, but Oliver's silence made Thomas feel that something was wrong. Usually cheerful and energetic, Oliver was quiet that morning, only stirring his food on his plate. "Son, is something wrong? Why are you so quiet?" Thomas asked carefully. Without looking up from his plate, Oliver replied, "Daddy, I had a bad dream last night." Thomas's heart started racing. Could Oliver's dream be connected to his own terror? "What did you dream about?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Oliver hesitated for a moment before looking up at his father. "We were on the bridge, you and me, but it was very dark. You were trying to reach me, but I couldn't move. Then something came out of the darkness. A man with no face. He was watching me, but he had no eyes." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Oliver's dream was identical to his own experience on the bridge. It couldn't be just a coincidence. Trying to maintain his composure, Thomas leaned in and hugged his son. "It was just a dream, son," he said softly. "You're safe here. Nothing will happen to you." But these words did little to convince Thomas or comfort Oliver. The dream suggested that the curse of the bridge was not letting them go. Thomas knew he needed to find a way to end this curse. That day, Thomas decided to visit the town library. If he was to uncover the truth about Midnight Bridge, the best way was to look into the town's history. After dropping Oliver off at school, he headed to the library. The library was an old stone building in the center of town, and its interior looked as antiquated as its exterior, with walls lined with books and dim lights giving it an ancient feel. The librarian, an elderly man, greeted Thomas with a warm smile. "How can I help you?" he asked kindly. When Thomas mentioned he was looking for information about Midnight Bridge, the librarian's face momentarily hardened, but then his smile returned. "There aren't many records about that bridge," he said, "but we have some documents on the town's history. You might find something there." Thomas moved to the shelves the librarian had pointed out and began sifting through folders filled with old newspaper clippings, town chronicles, and maps. After hours of searching, he found a newspaper article from the time the bridge was built. The article mentioned that some workers had mysteriously disappeared during the bridge's construction. The townspeople interpreted these events as a curse on the bridge. However, no explanation was ever found, and the bridge was completed while the incidents were forgotten. Yet, there were also reports of similar disappearances after the bridge was finished. As Thomas read this information, his mind was in turmoil. Midnight Bridge was not just a structure. It seemed like a dark gateway that drew people in. He knew he needed to delve deeper to understand how the town dealt with this curse. Before leaving the library, Thomas thanked the librarian and set off to pick up Oliver from school. However, a plan began to form in his mind. If Midnight Bridge was indeed a kind of gateway, he needed to find a way to destroy it. That night, Thomas decided to return to the bridge. But this time, he would be prepared. He took a camera with him. No matter what happened, he wanted to document the curse and uncover the bridge's secret. Maybe, by understanding the origins of this curse, he could find a way to stop it. Before leaving, he had carefully tucked Oliver in and prayed for his safety. As he stepped out the door, a sense of unease washed over him, but he did not turn back. He walked through the dark forest toward the bridge, his heart racing with every step. The sight of Midnight Bridge through the mist was even more terrifying this time. As Thomas stepped onto the bridge, he felt an electrical charge in the air. He took out his camera and began recording. This time, nothing would catch him off guard. When he reached the middle of the bridge, he stopped and took a deep breath. Everything was silent, as if the world had come to a halt. But within this silence, he heard a whisper. It was so faint that it blended with the sound of the wind. But the whisper was coming closer to him. Thomas turned the camera toward the direction of the whisper and watched carefully. Suddenly, he noticed movement on the camera screen. It was as if something was emerging from the darkness, approaching him. The camera began to shake, but Thomas resolutely continued recording. Moments later, the faceless figure reappeared, but this time it was closer. Thomas recoiled in fear, but the figure kept coming toward him. The darkness was enveloping him, not allowing him to escape. The whispers echoed in his ears.
Come.
Come and see the truth. Thomas's mind was in disarray. Was the whisper speaking directly to him? Was the figure trying to convey something? But before Thomas could grasp the meaning of the whispers, the bridge suddenly began to tremble. The darkness was pulling him in. The world was spinning before his eyes, everything turning to black. Holding tightly to the camera, Thomas took one last look at the recording. What he saw was more than just a nightmare. The cursed bridge harbored a power that threatened all reality, and he was on the verge of discovering that truth. Suddenly, everything went dark. As Thomas fell into the unknown, he began to understand what lay beneath the bridge. The bridge was not just a gateway, it was a prison, and this prison drew curious souls like him, never letting them escape. The midnight bridge shuddered one last time, and everything was swallowed by darkness. Thomas, as he drifted unconscious across the bridge, suddenly found himself in a dark void. The cold he felt turned into an entity that enveloped his body. Everything was blurry and shapeless, as if time and space had completely dissolved. Conscious thoughts became increasingly distant and hazy. Gradually, a light began to appear in Thomas's mind. He couldn't distinguish whether the events on the bridge were a dream or reality. However, when he opened his eyes, he found himself in the middle of the bridge, surrounded by a dark mist. The mist enveloped everything and made it difficult for Thomas to progress. He tried to breathe deeply, but the air felt as if it were filled with dense tobacco smoke, making it hard to inhale. A voice echoed from Thomas's left, a faint whisper saying, "Come closer, look more closely," reached Thomas's ears. The voice felt as though it was coming from nearby, but he couldn't pinpoint its source. Thomas, trembling with fear, turned to look in the direction of the voice, but only saw the dark mist. In this dark environment, he felt the presence of something. The faceless figure from the bridge seemed to have returned. With every step, the figure drew closer, making the bridge's stones tremble and emitting a deep rumbling. Thomas's heart raced, and his eyes darted around the darkness. At that moment, a light flared from the edge of the bridge. The light seemed familiar to Thomas. It shone like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Thomas decided to walk towards the light, hoping it might be the key to solving the bridge's mystery. As he approached the light, the surrounding darkness became denser. The light appeared to be shining from behind a door. Thomas extended his hand towards the light, and suddenly, he saw the horrifying figure appear right in front of him. The faceless entity was now clearer and more defined. It had no eyes, but there was a dark aura around it. Thomas began to tremble with fear. The figure moved silently towards Thomas. His urge to flee gave way to a paralysis of terror. He wished for the nightmare to end quickly, but as the figure approached, all his thoughts were wiped away. The sensation of emptiness and coldness intensified as the figure drew nearer. Suddenly, Thomas realized he was close to the figure. A dark hand touched his shoulder. Thomas's eyes widened in terror. The touch felt like an electric current surging through his entire body. The cold and emptiness inside him grew stronger. With one final burst of courage, Thomas gathered himself and shouted at the figure, "What do you want from me? Why are you here?" The figure turned silently and took a step away. Thomas watched the figure's movements closely. The figure suddenly started heading towards the light. Thomas followed its movements and continued towards the light. Perhaps the figure was a key to the bridge's secret. Thomas followed the figure and got closer to the light. The light now shone from behind an old and worn-out door at the end of the bridge. The door appeared ancient, with various symbols and inscriptions on it. Thomas stood before the door and decided to open it to see inside. As he pushed the door open, the light spread rapidly. Thomas found himself in an old room behind the door. Inside the room were old items and writings related to the bridge's construction. In the corner of the room, Thomas found an old book on a large table. The book contained details about the bridge's history and the work done. Thomas approached the book and carefully examined its pages. The book described a ritual performed during the construction of Midnight Bridge, giving the bridge a special power. The purpose of the ritual was to awaken an ancient power beneath the bridge, which provided protection against any interference with the bridge. However, this power also drew anyone approaching the bridge towards it. As Thomas reached the end of the book, he found a warning about the bridge. The bridge is a passage that exists only in darkness. Those who seek to solve it must confront their own darkness. Reading this, Thomas experienced a moment of enlightenment. Midnight Bridge was not just a structure but a dark passage, and to solve it, he needed to confront his own fears. Thomas closed the book and decided to leave the room. He now understood the bridge's secret. It could only be solved by self-discovery. The terror he experienced on the bridge was a form of test, and passing this test meant confronting his inner darkness. When he returned to the bridge, he couldn't see if the figure was still there. The darkness was slowly starting to dissipate. Thomas decided to leave the bridge and head home. But now, there was something he didn't know. The secrets of Midnight Bridge had left a permanent mark on his life, and this mark could only be resolved through his own internal journey. As he made his way home, he felt a new sense of determination. The experiences of that night had taught him the necessity of facing his own fears. In the coming days, he would need to research further to fully understand how to break the curse of Midnight Bridge. But this time, he possessed a mind capable of overcoming not just the bridge but his own inner darkness. Thus, Thomas's struggle with Midnight Bridge would continue.